So, one-eyed sword fighters. Pretty badass, huh? Deathstroke, Baiken, Guts, and many more. There's quite a number of sword fighters in general. How badass exactly are they? Like, how difficult is this to fight with one eye? So the first thing that comes to mind, obviously, is depth perception. So depth perception is pretty important in swordsmanship. You need to know your own reach, you need to know the opponent's reach, you need to know where in space you are. Because if you don't, they will take advantage of that and they will bait you in a position where you don't think they can hit you, but they can, and it's over pretty quickly. So you do need to be able to judge that. It's one of the things you learn. One of the fundamentals in sword fighting and other martial arts too, for that matter, distance and timing. So how do you do that if you don't have two visual inputs from different angles that combine into one image to tell you how things are located in space? Losing that one half of visual input is of course a challenge. But some people do surprisingly well. There are drivers with either limited or no vision on one eye. There are sports players. For example, there is a football player by the name of Wesley Walker who has very, very limited vision on one eye, almost none. Basically, what other people see at 200 feet, he sees at 5 feet. And he says he has no trouble estimating the distance of a ball and catching it and judging the speed, etc. And his track record shows that. He's been very successful at it. And that's because there are monocular depth cues as well, namely linear perspective, interposition, relative size, motion parallax, and texture gradient. For linear perspective, think of looking at a road that stretches out into the distance. The sides of the road are parallel, but in the distance, they converge. So that gives you an idea of how far something is away. Interposition means that if one object is behind another, it's obviously further away. So if the sword is in front of me, obviously, it's closer to you than I am. If it's behind me, I'm closer than the sword. Then you have the relative size. On top of a skyscraper, people will look like ants or become tiny spots, and gigantic buildings will become pretty small in the distance, obviously. And then you also have shadows telling you something about the relative position in space. Motion parallax means that closer objects seem to be moving faster than far away ones. So if you're sitting in the car and you look at a distant landscape, like some tree in the distance, for example, it seems to be moving fairly slowly compared to some shrubs that are right on the side of the road, things like that. Texture gradient means that the closer something is, the more detail you can make out. I can't really show this on camera because it will be out of focus, so you might actually see less if it's closer. But in general, like the wire wrap, for example, at a certain distance, you won't see this anymore. This will just become black to your eyes, whereas closer up you can see the differences. And fortunately, the brain's neuroplasticity allows you to adjust to these things over time. So if you lose sight in one eye or lose the eye altogether, you will over time become better at picking up on these other cues to help you determine the distance. And of course, also familiarity plays into it. Originally, I wanted to do some tests, set up a target at a certain distance and see how well I'm able to judge whether or not I'm in range, in measure with the sword. But then I realized that really wouldn't prove anything, because for one, I'm not used to looking only through one eye, and also I'm familiar with this space here right now, and if I set something up, so if I place an object over there and then I walk around, my brain will subconsciously keep track of the steps that I took away from it, so I will have a better idea of something that I put somewhere myself as opposed to somebody approaching me. So in this situation, it would be easier in some ways because I'm familiar with the distance, but it will also be harder because I have not adjusted to not seeing through one of the two eyes. So this just would be inaccurate. Some people have lost vision in one eye report an interesting effect where they say that the the image that they perceive seems to be a little stretched compared to how it was before, because apparently the brain tries to compensate for the lack of input on one side and just kind of wants to create this illusion of having a full vision. And some say they perceive a bit of a black overlay on one side, which is strange. You would think it would just be one image. I don't know if this is the case for everybody. Different brains process things differently, so this might not be the same for everybody. If that's the case, that would be a bit more of an hindrance or annoyance, at least for a while, but this could also potentially change over time as the brain adapts. One person said, sometimes I run into things on my left side because I feel that the center of my vision is the center of my body, which is no longer the case. So of course there are limitations. Pouring liquids typically tends to be difficult, at least at first, because you're just not used to it. But again, over time, apparently the brain becomes better at it, and you become used to moving your head more, because of course you have a lack of peripheral vision. Which, by the way, it may be easy to think that if you lose one eye, you lose 50% of your vision, but from what I've read, you lose about 20%. And that seems about right. So if you look at a room or something and keep track of exactly what you see, and then you close one eye or cover it up, you notice that you don't actually lose 50% exactly. If you hold out your arms and you check, where you can still see your hands, and then you cover up one side. So right now, I start to see the other hand here. So this is definitely more than half. A full field of vision is around 170 degrees. And on my GoPro, the super view is actually also 170 degrees. So if you lose one eye, it will probably look something like this. So you don't lose as much visual input as you might think at first glance, no pun intended, but it's certainly a limitation, obviously. So what does that mean for a sword fight? In a one-on-one duel, it's not actually that big of a deal, because in a sword fight, you always want to face the opponent. So you want to look at them straight on anyway. Now, there are some guards that wouldn't really lend themselves to this, like a retracted wrath guard would be a terrible idea to do on this side, because now I can't see you at all, meaning the camera. Whereas if I did it on this side, that's fine, obviously. So some positions would be disadvantageous, but most of them really, high guard, long point, plow on either side, fool's guard, etc. Most of the guards are fine because you're going to be more or less squared off to the opponent anyway, and you're going to look at them directly. So if they move over there, of course, I'm going to turn my entire body to keep facing them. So I'm always going to track them anyway. So in that sense, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. With multiple opponents, that's a big deal, because if somebody sneaks up on you from your blind side, there's really no way for you to notice that unless you constantly turn and scan, which against multiple opponents you have to do anyway. But here's the thing, against multiple opponents, you're screwed anyway. Really the only reason why characters are so effective against multiple opponents in movies and video games is because they politely wait their turn and attack one at a time, maybe two at a time, and even then they don't coordinate it very well. I've done occasionally sparring against two opponents, and when I had the reach advantage by using a spear, it wasn't too difficult because the reach just compensated for that, but it still wasn't easy. If you fight two opponents with the same kind of reach, so let's say everybody has long swords, this becomes really, really difficult, especially if they work together even halfway well. It's just you cannot respond to two attacks from different directions at the same time. If they flank you, you're pretty much done. It's extremely difficult. And the more there are, the worse it is. If you have 3 or 4 opponents, basically no chance. Unless they're complete idiots who have no idea what they're doing, and you're an absolute master. Unless that happens, the cards are stacked against you. But fictional heroes are so far above and beyond everything else that they can deal with that. And that also means that this is not going to bother them as much because they are way more skilled than everybody else. So a disadvantage like this, they can compensate for. So this just makes them yet even more badass. Now, if you had two fighters going against each other, which are supposed to be at the same skill level, and one has two fully functional eyes and the other has one, that's a disadvantage. So in that case, they would most likely lose if the weapons and the skill are exactly the same, exactly comparable. But if they're above somebody else, it may not matter all that much. And by the way, if you happen to have limited or no vision in one eye and you're interested in learning swordsmanship, don't be discouraged. I've practiced with people with disabilities before, and they just work harder than others and they can achieve a lot. So don't be discouraged. Don't think you can't do this just because of that. You absolutely can. It may be a bit more challenging, but if you're passionate about it and put in the work, you'll make progress. So yeah, that's about all I've got on this topic. Hope you found it interesting. Thanks for watching and have a good one, folks.